So thank you. As Richard mentioned, I head up the Data Legal EMEA team, and I'm also part of the legal team at UBS that's responsible for giving legal advice on responsible AI deployment across the globe. This quite often includes things that cover IP, security, data privacy, and the ethical considerations. And I say this because whilst I'm not an expert in any of those except the data privacy elements, it's quite difficult often to separate out where their specialisms end and start, just because of the way that AI is being deployed across the globe. I'm going to literally got this slide here, which I did not prepare for full disclosure. And the reason I show this is because whilst there are only 4 colours on that globe or chart, and they show basically where there are high levels of restrictions related to data privacy, there are no data privacy requirements in place. Actually, when you look at the different types of legislation and requirements in each of those, there are hundreds. The only thing that people can seem to agree on is that sometimes everyone says you can rely on consent, but even that within itself means different things in different jurisdictions. Just to add, in 5 years' time, 5 years ago, this looked very, very different. In 5 years' time, I imagine most of this chart will look red. So moving on to the AI global landscape, despite all the buzz around AI, again, I did not prepare this, it was prepared this year, however, only China so far has hard laws in place. The vast majority of countries have got some sort of guidance, policy, idea of things that they want to put in place. And I must admit, there was a period of time a couple of weeks ago where every time I blinked, it felt like something was coming out. And it was very, very hard to stay on top of it all. The EU AI Act, as most of you will probably know, has now been delayed. Whilst the final text is still due to be out in December of this year, in terms of its passing, it's now, instead of being January, it's expected to be passed in February to April-ish of next year instead. Again, much like data privacy, the lawmakers and regulators across the globe cannot even seem to decide what AI is, which makes it a very, very complicated area to be able to regulate or decide what your policies and procedures are going to be in terms of development and deployment. Some of these jurisdictions are having very, very narrow approaches as to where their regulations will apply. Some are taking very broad brush principles. Some are taking a very, very structured approach. The way that we have dealt with this is, being a global company, is that we have decided to create our own definition and decide where we're going to look at AI implementation. We're going to take a principles-based approach and take every single law and regulation to the extent possible into account. The reason that we have done this is because the way that we see the AI deployment is we're not going to be deploying our AI in one country. We're going to want to, at some point in time, want to extend it to various divisions across our bank. And those divisions obviously operate globally. So, before I get into some of the more specific data protection requirements, I'm going to go very, very briefly, and I'm going to do this quite quickly just because I want to concentrate on the data privacy requirements. There's 3 things that I think you need to consider. Is AI the best solution? So there is a lot of desire, and I'm sure you guys have all had it in the same way that we have. Everybody wants to use generative AI. Everybody wants to use AI. Recent studies have shown, however, that whilst there is, for junior staff members, it is beneficial and quicker, it speeds them up and provides a better quality of work as a starting point. When it comes to more skilled labour, it is sometimes it has very little impact on the time it takes them to produce the work that you want them to, or it sometimes has led to a slight shortfall in the quality of work that is produced. And actually, even if you are going to only use it for the more junior levels tasks, one of the things I will say from personal experience, I was doing my training contract. I was due to start my training contract just before the financial fall market a few years ago. My training contract was delayed. As a result of that, I did obviously qualify a little bit later on. 3 years later, our companies, a load of firms were going out looking for people that were 2 to 3 years qualified. Guess what? There were none. So longer term, it still had that impact, and you ended up having to pay more for that same resource than if you just kept going. So you do have to think about the longer term implications of when you're implementing responsible AI programs. Secondly, is it cost effective? It may well be for the initial task. However, it may depend on what task you're doing. If your review is going to take longer than if you just produced it from scratch yourself, it's probably not worthwhile. That being said, in the legal sphere, we have used templates for years. So if you can use generative AI to create a template for you and then review it, mark it up, tailor it to your requirements, don't see any problem with it. There will be issues where, for example, I had a coder call me up and say, can I use generative AI to create a code? And my 2 questions were to him. Number 1, is it quick for you? He said yes. I said, number 2, if it goes wrong, how quickly can you fix it? And what he said to me was his response. And I was like, okay, well, that's an issue. If you can't tell me you can fix it, or it's going to take you longer to fix it, then I'm going to ask you whether what you're doing is cost effective in the first place. And then I think Jonathan mentioned earlier, obviously, there is the ethical considerations. There has been, I can't remember which study it was, so excuse me, but there have been questions asked about if you had an electronic car driving along and that electronic car was to fail, it was led by AI, obviously, and you asked 2 different cultures, what would you want it to do? Obviously, everyone said, we want to stop. We don't want it to do we don't want to cause any harm. You now have an elderly gentleman and a young child crossing the road. You ask different cultures what they would say, which life they're going to save. Some would say the elder, some would say the younger. So when you're thinking about your ethical considerations and you're applying AI across the globe, you do have to work out how you're going to manage these cultural differences and what is acceptable. I don't know how many of you are involved in answering questions about data privacy. I know from my personal experience, previously, whenever I was asked about data and in models or of any sort whatsoever, whether it was AI or otherwise, it was always at the stage where data was going to be used. So people would come to me, they'd already designed their plan, they'd said, right, this is the data I need, can you do a DPIA, tell me what you want, etc. At that point in time, we'd say, can you use anonymized data, can you use pseudonymized data, do you actually need this data at all, can you go get it somewhere else? I am finding, and I'm pretty sure it's a good thing from my perspective, I'm now getting it at just below the idea stage. Can we do this? And the reason they're doing that is because there's a lot of expense attached to developing an AI system. If it's going to produce an output that you can't use, potentially prohibited, there's no point in going down that route. There are other things that there are overlapping AI and data privacy requirements. So whereas previously people would come to me and say, right, this is the point where I need it, actually, because a lot of the AI principles overlap with the data privacy principles, what you want to do is actually, when you're looking at your model, you want to build your model so that it already takes those principles into account. And then also the other thing is, if you come to a data privacy lawyer or advisor in the first instance, it is easier for us to give you the path of least resistance. If you tell us way in advance what you're trying to do, I will say, this is the art of the possible, this is going to cause you a problem. It's just gets you around the stumbling blocks before you hit them, essentially. So the other things are you going for a global or a regional approach? This is important because obviously, as you've seen from the slides at the beginning, it will make a difference as to what you want to comply with. If you are going to be complying with APAC, if you're going to deploy your model in APAC and in the EU, you're going to have higher requirements. And so you're going to have to be able to say, okay, I'm going to build my AI in a way that complies with all of those requirements because that's where I want to go. If you're going to go somewhere there is no AI requirement, data privacy or AI requirements, you're going to have a much lower threshold. You're going to be a lot more flexible with what you want to build. So you do have to have a view as to what you want to do in the first place. The other thing that you want to look at is your existing data privacy governance model. So when GDPR came out, most companies decided what they were going to do is have a baseline, and where there was higher requirements, they were going to uplift in those regions. that doesn't necessarily work for AI. And the reason is because of that whole initial point of where do you want to apply your AI model to? And if you want to apply it globally, you want it to work consistently across those regions. And so therefore, you can't have that same aspect. So then the question comes, are you then going to raise all of your data privacy requirements up where you can? Obviously, you don't want to be doing DSARs globally. But if you need to imply certain things to a higher level so that you can get your AI consistent, that might be a better approach for you, but it might also be very, very bureaucratic, and you just have to be aware of those things. I've also already mentioned the culture and the ethics point. One of the other things is you want your data, when you're developing a model or deploying it, to be representative of the regions or countries that you're going to apply it to. And that is because, again, it's down to, there might be jurisdictional differences in the way that people behave, in what the cultural norms are, and so on and so forth. So you want the data to be representative of that. This causes an additional issue of data transfers. There are, obviously, some countries are very, or increasingly becoming quite keen on data localization, particularly for certain data. And so, for example, you've got the Chinese PPL, which is going to basically say, we don't want you transferring our data out of here at all. And if you wanted to deploy your AI within China, you'll have the stricter AI requirements. You'll have to develop and deploy in China. And then it becomes very difficult to use that model anywhere else anyway. So you might have issues there in any case. And then in terms of that data transfer, of course, even if you do have permission, you've got to think about whether you are able to transfer that data just to train the model as opposed to use your AI. And those are two very different things for lawful basis of processing. So moving on here, I'm just very conscious of time. So where you've got your data privacy requirements and your AI requirements, they meet. Obviously, the first one is data. And I've highlighted two sections here with data monetization and requires a large volume. And the reason I've highlighted these two in red is because they conflict. Under most under most data protection laws, there is a principle of data minimization. You need to use data as little as possible. AI works better if you have more data. Good quality data, admittedly. And the way that I use this example is, if you put rubbish in, you put rubbish out, right? I was very, very young as a child when my parents told me that if I ate a watermelon seed, it would grow inside me and I would die. It took until 11 years old when I went to biology class for me to realise that was not true. I had the discernible ability at that age to work out that this was not true. AI may not. So you're going to have to work out how to make sure that you get good quality data into your system, and also that it's representative of what you need to do. So it may well be that you don't need all the data in the world. It may be that you just need, a location of someone, their financial status, how many children they have, and then you don't need, the specific postal code, etc. So there are ways around it, but generally the more data you have, the better it is to train an AI model. Of course, there are other options to this. So the data protection laws obviously only apply where there is personal data. You can get around this by having synthetic data, and there is definitely a market growing for synthetic data sets to be created. Or you can basically say, well, we're going to try and scrap that and get anonymized data and not use personal data at all, and see how that works. I think it depends on how you're trying to, or what you're trying to do with your AI model in the end as to whether that is a feasible option or not. And then there is, of course, proportionality. So are you being proportionate in your response? And some countries will allow a proportionate and risk-based approach, others won't. So you have to think about those as well. I think there's no doubt whatsoever that all AI deals with automated decision-making. Where personal data has an impact is generally in the EU, if there's a significant legal effect, then there is a problem. But even then, there are issues within jurisdictions. Even within the EU, there are difficulties with ADM. So the EU took the approach with the GDPR, for example, that automated decision-making was prohibited. The UK looked at the same article, and this was pre-Brexit, and said, we don't think that's a general prohibition. That says you can do it under certain conditions. So even when there is one set of text, people are still interpreting it very, very differently. And obviously with AI, it's not about whether there is a significant legal effect or not. It is is there an automated decision making being made? I've touched on accuracy already in terms of data in, data out. How are you going to rectify not only your system if incorrect data has gone in, but also the outputs? So the outputs will affect the individual, but ideally for your company, you want to make sure that the data that's gone in has also been corrected so that it doesn't keep making the same error. And this links on to the fairness and bias point. So if you keep having the same errors coming through and it keeps learning from itself, you're going to create a ring, and it's just going to keep enhancing, or not enhancing, that's quite the wrong word. It's going to continue making your bias or unfairness even greater. And then there is transparency and explainability. Very similar concepts, but also quite different in terms of data privacy legislation. For data privacy legislation, you obviously have to tell people what you're doing, why you're doing it, and so on and so forth. And obviously, if you're using AI, you have to tell them that you're using AI. In certain circumstances, if decisions are made on an automated basis, you have to tell them how you've got to that decision. For AI, you have to think about the explainability, and this is the black box issue. I think there is very few people that know how AI works. Truly, I'm not one of them, to be honest. I know that data goes in, data comes out, there's an algorithm in between. Yeah, we have to think about what you have to explain and whether you are going to do that as part of your data privacy requirements or whether you're going to do that completely separately. And that, again, will depend on whether you're using personal data or not. From a UBS perspective, we are trying not to create an entirely new process for AI. What we are trying to do is build in our existing model governance processes, build on our existing privacy governance policies, and so forth, so that we can uplift to meet the requirements where AI is being implemented, as opposed to starting a whole new governance process. That may or may not work for you, depending on how big your organization is. The other part with fairness and bias is the continuous monitoring, obviously, to make sure that things do not go wrong. And if they do go wrong, how quickly and effectively you're going to be able to fix that. Are you going to wait until people come to you and say, there's an issue here? Or are you going to do that proactively? And I would suggest that as proactively, just because of the way that the legislation is coming towards you at the moment. And then finally, in terms of the way that the purposes, generally with data privacy, and I'm pretty sure across the globe, it is principle-based where there is laws in place. There aren't any banned uses, so you can take a risk-based approach on what you're trying to do. Obviously, with the EU AI Act, that is not going to be the case. It's going to be prohibited purposes and banned. And I think there are some very stringent requirements in China, for example, if you are going to create a deep fake, they call it a deep fake, then you have to watermark it and say this is a deep fake. However, what is considered to be a deep fake? And I will give you this example because I had to deal with it recently, and I had to do quite a lot of thinking about how this is going to work. We were approached by a company who create avatars. And when you think of avatar, I think of little cartoon character, etc. And they were going to create these of some of our employees. Great initiative, etc. And the idea being that we could use these avatars internally to do training for our employees, etc. I asked the question, how similar are these avatars to the individuals? Is it personal data that you're creating here? Is the individual going to be identifiable from this avatar? They sent me a link. I could not tell it was not a human that was on the video. It was that good, and they said to me, it's going to get better. This then overlaid into, well, is that personal data? Does the individual have a right to delete it? There are consent issues around that. Can I even get consent because it's of an employee? There's obviously the imbalance of power issues, etc. And if they'd come to us right at the beginning when they'd said, we're thinking about this, again, it comes back to that timing issue. Come to us right at the beginning and we'll say, here's all your issues and here's what we need to deal with first, instead of sort of having to deal with it retrospectively. And then last couple of points, accountability, obviously. There is accountability under data privacy laws in any case. We are not proposing that the same individual who is accountable for our data privacy is accountable for AI, and that is because we believe that the accountability starts way before the data does in terms of AI. And so we're still working through where that is going to sit in terms of our organisation. And then there are other impacts, obviously, things like ESG requirements. When you are deploying your AI, how expensive is it going to, how big an impact is it not only going to have on your environment, and as a financial institution, obviously you will be caught by ESG requirements, but also, longer term social skills, and things like that, what sort of impact it's going to have. So those are all things that we're already thinking about and trying to build into our requirements. So I think we have time for questions. Yes. Yes.
So just talking about liability and ownership. If an AI, code uses AI to generate a piece of code, which then gets included in a sort of a whole system that is used, where does the ownership lie? Because now that code obviously sitting in the open universe. How do you handle that? I mean, what would the considerations be in terms of ownership of the code?
So in terms of our AI that we would be using, we're only deploying internally at the moment. We're not deploying external facing AI at the moment, and that is very simply to avoid these sorts of issues. We are obviously building on open source AI, but obviously we've got the licenses and things like that. And we've also downloaded our own versions of OpenAI so that we can keep that within our closed network to stop data loss, etc. So that's how we are dealing with it. We are conscious that there are lots of business areas and use cases where people do want to go and use it externally, and we're trying to work out those things. We haven't quite got there yet in terms of that deployment.
So you mentioned about how you're looking to enhance your existing requirements for data privacy. So my question is, what exactly is going to be new that you're going to implement in terms of requirements over the next sort of 6 months?
So there will be the area. So we've obviously created our own principles which overlap significantly with existing data privacy principles. So there's obviously the accountability one, which we are building up in any case. So we can say, right, here is where the scope is going to broaden out in terms of what you're accountable for. And we've got a data ethics policy that, for example, previously was quite narrow. We're now saying that now needs to encompass everything that we are doing. And then that accountability bit will obviously also sit separately with AI once we've sorted out the governance around that. There's the explainability part. So we are definitely saying, well, actually, if there's personal data involved, this explainability isn't just about what we are doing and how we're doing it. You're going to have to start explaining how that AI works, even if that links out to an additional purpose. And in terms of governance around that, we are obviously saying that needs to all flow. So when we buy in third-party vendors, IT, etc. Obviously, we've got vendor processes, etc. We're now obviously building out our DPQs. We're building out our vendor processes in relation to those so that we can start saying, right, those are all now brought in. Data privacy, you're now going to have to help with that whole governance process and building those out as well. So we can say that the principles themselves still apply, however, the scope of them themselves is much broader. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.